Hello. Yep, back for now another episode preparing for exam number 3. Um just kind of continuing it as is. We got the exam is this week. It's Sunday, the exam's Thursday. Feeling pretty good about this material. I think I'm feeling a little bit better about this exam going into this exam than the last exam. I did all right on the last exam. But I'm definitely feeling a little more comfortable with this material than the last exam material. Granted, this exam is definitely gonna. It seems to be built on it's gonna have. It seems like it's more 15 pointers and 5 pointers and less 10 pointers. So I feel like it's gonna be a lot of 15s and a couple fives and maybe 110 on the exam. So definitely you're gonna have to be a little more elaborate in my answers and provide more evidence. Just go a little more in depth and provide more detail. And not get away with those 10 point answers as much. And the 5 pointers, those are pretty straightforward. Those are he doesn't want a whole lot of elaboration on that. He just wants pretty much a straight shot answer on those. Pretty simple. This time I'm gonna do kind of what I've been doing with these for this outline since it's a little since this one takes me a bit longer and I don't think I've ever gotten through this entire thing in one video. Just hour 20. Once it gets beyond that, it gets a bit hard, it takes a lot of time to upload and stuff. So I try to just keep it around that hour 20 minute mark. So I'm going to start at the back and work to the front since last time I started at the front and worked to the back. Um, I guess I'm just going to kind of get started. I've added a couple more slides just to go with a couple of the questions, cases and stuff like that. But I really I haven't done a whole lot since the last video. Just some brief rereading through some of the material over the past couple days, and just reviewing some of the slides, reviewing some of the questions. Just gonna keep doing that. We got a couple group study sessions this week as a class, so that always helps a lot, at least for me. Reassure some of my answers, maybe just focus some of my attention somewhere where I had been kind of unknowingly have been avoiding, or just completely have overlooked, where I've been a little arbitrary and capricious on a couple answers. But I'm just gonna get started. Like I said, this outline takes a lot of time to get through, so I don't want to blow a bunch of time before I even start. So I'm just gonna start here, starting right off the bat with question 29. How are multiple use lands administered by the National Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management managed differently than lands designated as wilderness under the 1964 Wilderness Act? Please explain the major differences, including philosophy and purposes of each mandate/system, uses allowed and not allowed in both systems, etc. The issue of managerial discretion and reference to the relevant statutes in your answer. So, with the BLR, I guess I'll just start with the multiple use lands. And I've made a slide here where it kind of has compare and contrast a little bit. What I should do is do a Venn diagram. So there is probably a little, there is some overlap between the two. Not a lot, but I feel like, if I were to actually, if I could dig in a little bit, I could probably find some overlap. But, anyway, kind of getting distracted. But, okay, so starting with the multiple use lands administered by the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM. You have that multiple use mandate, like in FLTMA, Section 202, shall use and observe the principles of multiple use, and then goes on to define multiple use as, management of the public lands and their various resources so that they are utilized in the combination that will best meet the present and future needs of the American people. A combination of balanced and diverse resource uses, and that takes into account the long-term needs of future generations for the renewable and non-renewable resources, including but not limited to recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife and fish, and natural and scenic and scientific and historical values, without permanent impairment of the productivity of the land and the quality of the environment, with consideration being given to the relative values of the resources, and not necessarily to the combination of uses that will give the greatest economic return or greatest unit input. And that's a paraphrased definition of multiple use from FLTMA. And then obviously the Forest Service MUSIA, Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960, is that predates the multiple use mandate for the BLM, but the language is very similar in both of them. It's just as discretionary. to what multiple uses the land should be managed for. They're both very similar. The multiple use mandate, like I said, is very similar for both agencies. Neither of these multiple use mandates contain any prohibitions. There's no prohibited acts on these, or no prohibited uses on those multiple use lands. And like I said, it's very discretionary. It's there's there's no weight placed on any multiple use. It's open ended to just a balancing of these resources and uses when deciding which one to use. And we see that in the case history of the multiple use mandate. First of which we go here to Perkins versus Berglund, which this is actually in reference to the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960, which pertains to which is directed at the Forest Service and Forest Service lands. But essentially, what the courts determined in that case was that the multiple use mandate is just general clauses and phrases that can hardly be considered concrete limits on agency discretion, and the famous breathes discretion at every pore line in reference to the multiple use mandate, which it just further shows that the multiple use mandate doesn't place any limits or guidelines onto which multiple use the land is managed for. It simply mandates that the multiple uses be considered and balanced when deciding which one is going to be used in that land, what that land's going to be managed for. I guess in a little bit of contrast to that, there was the Comb Wash case, which was pertained to was directed at the BLM, and when the BLM allowed for grazing on the Comb Wash allotment, in the Comb Wash allotment, and were challenged on it because they hadn't, in a balanced and reasoned and informed manner, came to that decision. They didn't balance the competing multiple uses. They had simply used a programmatic EIS and the RMP for the area. They hadn't really done any site specific analysis as to balance those multiple competing multiple uses. And this is where one of the few times where the courts did not defer to the agency discretion in relation to multiple use, and they remanded the BLM in that case simply because they hadn't made that decision to graze the Comb Wash allotment in a reasoned and informed manner that had balanced the competing multiple uses for that allotment. And like I said, the multiple use mandate, just very discretionary to the agency, no prohibitions, and as we'll see with the Wilderness Act, that is one area where it is very different. And yes, it's like I said, no weight placed on any sort of multiple use managing for any certain multiple use. It just lists a broad array of multiple uses in the definition, as we saw there. Recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife. So you got those amenities, and then you got those extractive uses, and like I said, it doesn't control discretion, border. What word am I looking for here? It doesn't have any guides on discretion. I guess it's broad discretion to what multiple use the land's managed for, and I feel like I'm just going in circles here, so I'm gonna keep moving. So kind of moving on to the wilderness, the wilderness areas. So going to the statute itself, Wilderness Act, Section 2A. Wilderness areas shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such a manner as will leave them unimpaired for future use and enjoyment as wilderness, and so as to provide for the protection of these areas, the preservation of their wilderness character. So in that, that's called the non-impairment. Is that right? Non-impairment mandate. So it's a mandate that these lands are to be unimpaired for future use, and so it calls for that unimpairment of the future use and that preservation of the wilderness character, and they should be administered for the use and the enjoyment of the American people. So already very different than the multiple use mandate in what it's asking the administering agencies, or how these lands should be, these wilderness areas should be administered. there's already there's some it's placing limits on discretion because it's going to limit uses that can only comply with this non-impairment mandate, as well as and uses that are primarily going to be for the use and enjoyment of the American people. And then also, there's that call to preserve that wilderness character. So already in that language, you have, some definite confines on that discretion of the agencies when managing for wilderness areas. And then, of course, going a little further into the act, you have Section 4C, which it calls out direct prohibitions as to what can't be done on these designated wilderness by Congress. So you got your no commercial enterprise, no permanent roads, no temporary roads, no motor vehicle use, no motorized equipment, no motorboats, no landing of aircraft. And then I'm also missing no installations, and I don't know if no other forms of mechanical transport, which that includes bikes. And then also no structure or installation, which we saw come up in the COFA National Wildlife Refuge and Wilderness case. But yeah, so there's already, like I said, compared to the multiple use mandate, not only do you have this this mandate that the land should be unimpaired for future use and the call to preserve the wilderness character of the wildernesses, then you also have this list of prohibitions too that can, yes, they can. There's the minimum necessity exception, but you have like I said, it's the minimum necessity exception. So there is exceptions, but only for the minimum necessary to continue administering that land in its wilderness condition. I didn't explain that well, and I don't know if I really need to go into that much for this question, but I will note there are exceptions to the prohibitions, but already compared to the multiple use mandates of the MUSIA and FLIPMA, we have this prohibition list as well as the non-impairment mandate. And then, also, there's that, in the definition of wilderness itself, when, what does wilderness character mean? And then when it defines wilderness, you have this, that untrammeled by man, in that definition, which is essentially, non-confining, maintaining that untrammeled by man condition. It's not confining or impeding or restraining any of those natural processes that would occur on a wilderness, such as like fire or disease or anything like that. So like I said, there are exceptions to those prohibitions, and and to manage. And like I said, there's that minimum necessity exception. But with that, there's that call to a very hands-off management of these of the wilderness. And like I said, even here, kind of going into that COFA National Wildlife Refuge wilderness case, the COFA Refuge had installed a couple of water tanks in order to preserve their population of desert bighorn sheep, which had suffered a pretty serious population decline. So they installed these water tanks as they believed that was the primary cause of the decline, was the lack of water. So they installed these water tanks. However, they are taken to trial or court over this, litigated, and they were remanded in this decision because they simply went in, they hadn't, the Fish and Wildlife Service, who administered COFA National Wildlife Refuge, did not establish that the tanks that they had installed, the two tanks that they had installed, were the minimum necessary. So they didn't, they didn't establish that the tanks were the minimum necessary. They also didn't establish that water was the actual direct cause, the necessity. The necessary action. They didn't provide that, yes, water is the exact reason why these bighorn sheep are dying. And I'm kind of going off topic here, but anyways, by establishing that, that water, those water tanks weren't, and the two water tanks weren't the minimum necessary to preserve those bighorn sheep, that was considered a trammeling by man, in not preserving that wilderness character. And I don't know if that contributes a whole lot to this question. I might have to kind of go back and rework this one a little bit. What is a national park enabling law? There's no. Yeah, okay. I think I got one. Okay. So, enabling laws are written by Congress pursuant to the Organic Act of the National Parks, and these enabling laws are written when a new park is designated. So each national park gets their own enabling law. The Organic Act, when the Organic Act was passed, it did have certain parks designated in that Organic Act, but then following that, every new park was, as it was designated, it was given a new enabling law. So I think like right here, okay. So here's the Organic Act of the National Park Service, 1916. So there already been some parks, established prior to 1916 before they got the Organic Act. But essentially, it just mandates that provide for the enjoyment. Yeah, it mandates what national parks how they should be managed or what they should be managed for, and then it also provides national parks hereafter created by Congress. So following that, it sets up that national parks will then be created by Congress, and when Congress designates a new national park, these new national parks are designated with an enabling law by Congress. And these enabling laws contain like more site-specific management criteria that goes beyond what is in the Organic Act. It's like I said, more site-specific for managing that designated park. And like here in the example, with the Grand Teton National Park, in their enabling law, it allowed for elk hunting within to be conducted within certain areas of the park. And yes, and like I guess the enabling law is like, this is what the park management first looks to the enabling law of the park when they're making management decisions. They don't look at the Organic Act over the enabling law. The enabling law trumps the Organic Act when they're making management decisions for a park. Like that was a 5-pointer. I probably went a little bit beyond what I should have there. What is the purpose of the national park management under the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916? So this is kind of that famous National Park Service dual mandate. So you have that conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and then there's also the provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So you kind of have those two definitely can be a little bit conflicting when you're trying to conserve the scenery and the historic objects within that park, but then you also have to provide for the enjoyment of the scenery and natural and historical objects by such means that will leave them unimpaired. So it's conservation, but then also providing for enjoyment. So that's it's a bit of a balancing act, and like I said, those are kind of butting heads, those mandates. And even here, I think conserve the scenery and also provide for the enjoyment. So it's you got that dual mandate, conflicting mandate, and so they're natural, managed to conserve the values of the land while also providing enjoyment for those who visit. These dual mandates are widely viewed as being contradicting to each other. So it's like I said, the dual mandate, conserve the scenery, and then provide for the enjoyment, and it definitely can be conflicting at times for sure. Explain the nature of two political compromises evident in the Wilderness Act of 1964. Provide an example of how one of these compromises could challenge the management of wilderness character. So I thought I had a slide that kind of pertained to this. Do not. It'd be the other way. I think I'm going the wrong way, so that doesn't help. Okay, so first one I got here is just section 4D1. Such measure may be taken as may be necessary in the control of fire, insects, and disease, subject to such conditions as the Secretary deems desirable. So this compromise, these are found in the Wilderness Act itself of 1964 in the statute. These aren't regulations, posts, or anything like that. These are actually 1964 statute. But anyway, so like I said, this first one here, 41, gives discretion to the secretary. Gives discretion to the secretary to make to take measures to control fire, insects, and disease within designated wilderness areas. Uh, it has it's quite a bit of discretion in this this first compromise because it has that as the secretary deems desirable, uh, you know discretionary limit, but so it places a little discretion on to what extent these measures may be used in that designated wilderness. There's that minimum necessity uh, clause though as well. And then we got section 4D3, which is until midnight, December 31st, 1983, the United States mining laws and all laws pertaining to the mineral leasing shall, to the same extent as applicable prior to September 3rd, 1964, extend to those national forest lands designated by this chapter as wilderness area. So essentially what this does is gives miners and prospective lessees 20 years to go into these wilderness areas and locate mining claims and pursue leases. So it gives a little bit of a window where people can still get into these forest lands, into this Forest Service land that's now been designated as a wilderness, and pursue mining claims and pursue leases. And this even allowed for miners. Miners could claim could apply for patents of these claims up until that that December 31st, 1983 date. And like I said, these claims and patents would then go on to pose challenge management challenges after that 1983 date when the land would be closed off, especially in terms of in respect to accessing those patents and claims after that wilderness is officially closed to mining law. Provide an example of how one of these compromises could challenge the management of wilderness character. I know I feel like I have a better example than the one I got here, but so there's that agency mandate to preserve the natural conditions and the wilderness character of the area. So in the Sierra Club versus Ling case, the Forest Service had authorized southern pine beetle control program within wilderness areas. So pursuant to that section 4D1, such measure may be taken as necessary to control fire insects. So like I said, the Forest Service authorizes this southern pine beetle control program within a wilderness area, and this required extensive cutting and use of chemical spraying. So that's definitely going against that, challenging the management of that wilderness character. And this did get this got taken to court. And I think it was found that this was, they had determined that this wasn't the minimum necessary, or they weren't providing evidence that this was actually effectively reducing that southern pine beetle infestation. Because I think the biggest concern in that case was that there were, adjacent to the wilderness area, there were, other, either private timber assets or, regular Forest Service timber assets, and even maybe a community. So the concern was the spread, of this infestation outside of the wilderness area. So this control measure was, I think, the rationale behind it was just to prevent that from happening. However, when I think they were, in that challenging, and in the decision, it was found that the Forest Service wasn't providing any evidence that the measures they had been taking were actually effective. And that was what had kind of, either ended this program or changed direction of it. Who designates federal wilderness areas? What agencies manage them? So, federal wilderness areas are designated by Congress and statute, post 1964. The Wilderness Act in 1964. There were some wildernesses that had been, that were designated in that original act, but all wilderness areas post 1964 Wilderness Act are designated by their own, I guess, enabling act or enabling law, similar to the National Park Organic Act that we had just talked about a few slides ago. I think, yeah. So, other side, but it's very similar. very similar in manner. And yeah, like I said, these are designated by Congress, and then these wilderness areas are managed by the agency that manages that surface land immediately prior to that land being designated as a wilderness. So say it was a Forest Service, it was this wilderness, the Forest Service identifies this area that has potential to be a wilderness. They propose it to Congress. Congress does ends up approving writing designating it as wilderness. The Forest Service then manages that wilderness area as from pre managed it or managed that land prior to it being designated wilderness, and then managed it continues to manage it post. But now it manages it not under those multiple use mandates of regular Forest Service land, but now we'll be managing it under the Wilderness Act non-impairment mandate, along with those prohibitions that we saw earlier as well. What is an individual national park and/or wilderness enabling / establishment law? How might these laws impact management of parks and/or wilderness areas? So, enabling and establishing laws are, like mentioned with the past two, are the laws written particularly when Congress designates either a national park or a new wilderness area. They're pursuant to the Organic Act, but they might these enabling laws, or enabling acts contain that site-specific management criteria, and then in the case of like wilderness areas, these the wilderness enabling laws are going to contain compromises that are particular to that given wilderness area. So how I talked about a few slides ago, the compromises in the statute, such as like the management of insects and fire and disease, or the allowance of that mining for 20 years prior, until 1983. Well, those enabling laws for those individual or new wilderness areas are also maybe going to contain their own compromises, similar to like the site-specific national park enabling acts, which might contain, in the case of like Grand Teton, like I mentioned earlier, that allowance for potentially for hunting within certain areas of the park, even though hunting is generally a prohibited action in most national parks. Let's see. Where am I here? Okay, so that was the enabling laws and acts. How might these laws impact the management of parks and wilderness areas? Okay, so kind of like what I just said, I guess. Those individual enabling laws and acts allow for different, they site-specific management criteria, and then therefore, either a certain wilderness, like I said, might have certain, compromises. I guess like in class we talked about the rattlesnake wilderness, especially in its enabling law, it has a special concession that allowed for motorized access by certain officials in order to maintain aquifers. There was, I guess that Missoula had gotten a lot of it. Historically had gotten a lot of water from that wilderness watershed. The rattlesnake wilderness watershed. There were dams in there that's where that water, those aquifers for that water, and so that when that was drafted and designated a wilderness, there was a concession or a compromise in there that allowed motorized access by those those water management officials to get in there and maintain those aquifers. And then and like I said, I'm harping on the Grand Teton National Park, but the elk hunting allowance in that park as well. By law, federally designated wilderness areas are to be untrammeled. What does this mean? Provide a management example in your answer. So, untrammeled, is like not developed, just kind of going straight to the dictionary definition here, but not developed, untouched, or without restraint, impediment, or unhindered. Like I mentioned earlier, it's that hands-off management, just kind of letting it do its thing and doing absolutely minimum necessary management on that land. Because to trammel something, not trample, is to hinder, restrain, shackle. So, to hold back. And I think I have a slide for this one as well. Because I feel like I've made quite a few slides. But anyway, so yeah. Hands-off message, hands-off management, and um, and there's this two-step inquiry that's kind of been established, and I'm for determining if a management action is you know if it's going to trammel the wilderness, or I think I'll have to go back and actually double check that this is directly tied to trammeling. But essentially, yeah, determining if like an action is trammeling of the wilderness. If first step, just asks, is this action necessary? So kind of going back to the Kofa case, is this action necessary? And in that case, they had there was the assumption that water was the necessary action, but they didn't provide that in the case, or in their evidence. They didn't provide that they had determined that water was the necessary action to preserve bighorn sheep to preserve that wilderness character, those natural conditions of that wilderness, by preserving those bighorn sheep. So say the water was, water is the, necessary action in the Kofa case. Then they go to step 2. Well, what is the minimum amount of said necessary to action to accomplish the management objective? So how many what is the minimum amount of water tanks that we could put on the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge in order to preserve those bighorn sheep and preserve that natural wilderness character, those natural conditions and the wilderness character of the Kofa wilderness. And they in the case they had put in 2, but they didn't. First off, they didn't provide the evidence that the water was the necessary action, and that they didn't provide any evidence as well that 2 water tanks was the minimum necessary to maintain those bighorn sheep. So yeah, like I said, I even got it down here. They had failed to provide that water tanks were necessary, and that 2 tanks were the minimum to meet the necessary management needs, and they were ruled arbitrary and capricious in decision to install 2 water tanks. So yeah, it's that untrammeling by man. So it's just that handoff management, or if you do have to do some sort of management, like in the case of the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge and Wilderness, because the courts did rule that they deferred to the agency interpretation that in the definition of wilderness there's that, or in the there's in the Wilderness Act, it calls for those administering agencies, that non-impairment mandate, but then there is that management to preserve those natural conditions, which included conservation. And so in the Kofa case, the Fish and Wildlife Service had interpreted conservation to include preservation of the bighorn sheep on that wildlife refuge / wilderness. And the courts had ruled and deferred to the agency interpretation of that. So it's not that the Fish and Wildlife Service could take action to preserve, or to conserve those bighorn sheep populations, because that the bighorn sheep are part of that natural those natural conditions and the wilderness character of the Kofa National Wildlife Refuge and Wilderness. It's just that they didn't provide that water was the next action necessary, and they didn't provide also that 2 tanks was the minimum necessary to to achieve stability in that bighorn sheep population. It's a bit tricky. Wilderness Act is definitely, there's a little more to it. There's some nuance to the Wilderness Act. I'm trying to think if I've covered everything I wanted to here. I think so. I mean, that's another one that I would like to get a little more work with. How are lands designated as federal wilderness to be managed according to the Wilderness Act of 1964? Be sure to explain the term wilderness character and its component parts in your answer. Each agency administering any area designated as wilderness shall be responsible for preserving the wilderness character of the area. So in the wilderness, it's defined in statute. There's that untrammeled by man, undeveloped federal land. So untrammeled, undeveloped, solitude, natural conditions. That's kind of like, I think those are like the main component parts of that wilderness character is that untrammeled, undeveloped, solid, opportunities for solitude, and preserving its natural conditions, protected and managed, as so as to preserve its natural conditions. And then there is also these some additional stuff like at least 5,000 acres or is of sufficient size to make practicable in its preservation, and then also may also contain ecological, geological, other forms of scientific education, scenic, or historical value. But yeah, so there's like that management, to preserve that wilderness character, and like I said, undeveloped, and defining wilderness character or wilderness, untrammeled, undeveloped, solitude, and natural conditions. And like I mentioned earlier, it had that, the Wilderness Act also contains that list of prohibited uses for these designated wilderness areas, which include, no commercial enterprise, no permanent roads, no temporary roads, no motor vehicles, motorized equipment, motor boats, no landing of aircraft, and no other forms of mechanical transport, no structure or installation. And these things may only, those prohibited uses. There is the exceptions only when they're necessary to meet the minimum requirements to administer that area as wilderness. And these lands are managed by that agency that had jurisdiction of the land immediately prior to its wilderness designation. I guess that's all I got for that one. I don't know if that's really a complete answer. Preservation of that wilderness character, untrammeled, undeveloped, opportunities for solitude, and preserving its natural conditions. And then, of course, there's a prohibited list as well, a prohibition list as well. Holy moly, this is a long one. Does federal wilderness provide greater protection to lands than those covered by the roadless rule and those designated and managed as areas of critical environmental concern by the BLM? Please explain and substantiate, and be sure to tell me what you mean by greater. So I guess right off the bat, I'll just start with the greater question there. But by greater, at least my interpretation of this is that something that with greater protection essentially means is that there's more limits placed on the administering agency's discretion or management discretion, or management and land planning discretion and decisions. And additionally, something that has greater protection also might be less liable to change or less easily changed. So kind of, I guess, just starting with the Wilderness Act, I would, and I consider that offers the greatest protection or greater protection than the roadless rule and the ACECs. It's the wilderness areas are designated by Congress in statute. The Wilderness Act itself is designated by Congress in statute. So these are statutory law. It's statutory law. So if it were to be changed, it would have to be changed by Congress. So it's definitely the least susceptible to change compared to the roadless rule and the ACECs, which are designated by the Forest Service, by the agencies, by the Forest Service, by the BLM in the land planning process. At least for the ACECs, those are designated in the RMPs. With the roadless areas, the IRAs, the inventoried roadless areas, those are designated by the findings of the Rare 1 and 2 evaluations that was mandated by Congress in the original Wilderness Act. But the roadless rule itself was promulgated by the Forest Service under the Clinton administration. But therefore it's much more liable to be changed as well. The stipulations of that rule, and same with the ACECs. Those can be those RMPs can be amended. Those ACECs can be changed, and what's limited in those ACECs can be changed as well. And essentially, I guess like we've mentioned with the Wilderness Act quite a bit, is it has those that Section 4C, prohibition, prohibited uses list, as well as that non-impairment mandate that calls for the management of the preservation of the wilderness character, and the management and protection as to preserve the natural conditions as well. So it's much more focused on, well, in that mandate, it mandates preservation. Like I said, kind of just going back to the designation though, and that's what the professor said. I went and I asked him about this one a little bit, and he said really what the focus of this question is just more on what, who designates these, who promulgates these regulations and rules, and then how liable would they be to change. So yeah, like I said, Wilderness Act, that's statute, that's statutory law, that's going to be much more difficult to change, or to be considered to be changed. Whereas with the roadless rule and the ACECs, that's agency regulation and rule making. So it's like I said, much more subject to change, and could be easily much more easily changed or just amended as well. So yeah, like I said, the roadless rule, it does have a couple prohibitions of road construction is a prohibited action in that roadless rule, as well as timber harvest, except with certain circumstances where timber harvest would be allowed. But it does, that's there's only those prohibited actions, and then it's maintaining that wilderness like character conditions. But it, like I said, it's subject to be changed as well. And yeah, like I mentioned with the ACECs, yes, they're established in those RMPs, but those RMPs can be amended, or when that new RMP is drafted, it might withdraw that ACEC designation. And the ACECs, like I said, going back to FLIPMA, is that they should be given priority to the designation and consideration in the land use planning process. And these are areas with that special management attention is required to prevent and protect against irreparable damage to significant resources. But there's no no direct prohibited actions in the actual in FLIPMA. And so it's it's, like I said, it's a site specific thing when those ACECs are established, what's going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed in them. But essentially, yeah, like those roadless area IRAs, ACECs are definitely going to be considered to have less protection than the Wilderness Act, the wilderness designated areas, which are, that's, like I said, just going to hammer this, but statutory law, much like, not very likely, very low chance of being changed or amended at any point, compared to those roadless IRAs and the ACECs, which can be amended and changed much more easily by shifting political pendulum swings. From a designation standpoint, i.e., who designates, how is the U.S. Forest Service's roadless rule different than the federal wilderness? So, kind of going back, I guess, touched on it a little bit in this one, but the wilderness areas, yeah, are designated by Congress in statute. The Forest Service was mandated in the original 1964 Wilderness Act to conduct an inventory and identify potential areas with potential to be designated as wilderness, and this was called the Roadless Area Review and Evaluation. Well, they conducted one, and then I can't remember what happened. I think there was a good deal of litigation, and that maybe that the Forest Service hadn't I can't think of the right word, but they were then they were required to do a second, so they did these are called the rare 1 and 2 reviews. Like I said, they were required by or mandated by the Wilderness Act to identify, to inventory these roadless areas, primitive areas for potential wilderness designation. And then, yeah, like I said, there's that 2001 roadless rule that was promulgated under the Clinton administration, and that prohibited construction of new roads on these IRAs. And I don't think I even actually answered those. But who designates the the roadless? Yeah, so I guess, how is the U.S. Forest Service roadless rule like the 2001 roadless rule, yeah, Clinton administration prohibits construction of new roads on the 58 million acres of inventoried roadless areas, IRAs. And then there's also prohibitions on logging as well, or very strong restrictions on logging in these IRAs as well. And these IRAs, like I said, they were identified in the Rare 1 and 2 reviews, and these IRAs are designated by the Forest Service as areas with potential to be wilderness areas, but are not designated wilderness. So I guess they're designated by the Forest Service to answer the question. What power was given to the President by the Antiquities Act of 1906? On what constitutional basis can Congress provide this power to the President? Why has the designation of national monuments caused conflict or controversy in the past? Make a substantiated argument for or against a more expansive use of the Antiquities Act by a President. Please be sure to focus on the law, the text of the statute, and not just provide your political opinion. Okay. So Congress in the Antiquities Act of 1906 gave the President the authority to reserve areas of federal land for certain uses or limit certain multiple uses, to preserve certain values of the land, whether they be historic, prehistoric objects of historic and scientific interest. So this this gave the President the authority to place limits on, he gave him, to place limits on that multiple use discretion, of these federal public lands. So this, I like the most common example is in these monument designations pursuant to the Antiquities Act is that they're often mining withdrawals or accompany these designations. But yeah, and Congress provides this power to the President pursuant to the Property Clause, which, going back to the Property Clause, gives Congress the power to make all needful rules and regulations respecting the property of the United States. So kind of, I guess, just going with the question here, I guess, making an argument for a more expansive use of the Antiquities Act by the President, kind of just, and, maybe like using it to designate larger areas as monuments, I guess. But, just looking at the language of the act itself, right off the bat, in his discretion, declare by proclamation, historic and prehistoric structures and other objects of historic and of scientific interest that are situated upon lands controlled by the U.S. May reserve as part thereof parcels of land, limits of which shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with the proper care and management of the objects to be protected. So yeah, just looking at, and I did paraphrase this a little bit, but essentially this is most of the act here, and the only there's very little limits on discretion here to the President. Opening line in his discretion, in the President's discretion, aside from this shall be confined to the smallest area compatible, the only real limit to his discretion in this would be, I think, the mandate that these lands have to be controlled by the U.S., owned or controlled by the U.S. Outside of that, there's very little. And even with this shall be confined to the smallest area compatible, is that, that's still solely based on the President's discretion. And as we saw especially, I like going to the Tulare County versus George W. Bush when discussing the size of the, potential limits on size of national monument designation. So, I have that Tulare County, they bring Clinton's, I guess, Clinton prior to leaving office designated the giant Sequoia National Monument. However, Tulare County takes him to court, and they argue that the designated monument was not to the smallest area compatible. Wasn't confined to the smallest area compatible. However, the courts come back and they upheld Clinton's designation, and they stated that the Antiquities Act does not oblige the President to make a meaningful investigation or determination of the smallest area necessary to protect any specified objects or scientific interests. So essentially, what they say there is that this act does not require the President to consult with anyone else or to make any sort of determination as or provide any evidence of any sort of decision making that to decide what the smallest area compatible to designate an area, or in the designation of a monument. So essentially, yeah, it's they state that it's pretty much entirely up to the president's own discretion what the smallest area compatible is for a national monument. And like I said, I like that case a lot for when looking at that smallest area compatible argument. And it like I said, it's not it's very it's like I said, there's very little statutory limit on that president's discretion, pretty much, except like I said, for the U.S. controlled or owned by the U.S. mandate. And I guess even they're also, besides size of the monuments potential limits, it's not only limited to, I guess, like the old argument had been that it was it's the Antiquities Act. It's mainly, it should be just for designation of like archaeological sites. But there's that. President Roosevelt proclaimed the Grand Canyon a national monument. 800,000 acres, huge national monument, and it eventually did become a national park. But you got that line in here, which other objects of historic and scientific interest. So objects is pretty discretionary, or pretty discretionary, open discretionary, and then like of scientific interest. And the court found the Grand Canyon, the Supreme Court deferred to TR's when taking to court over that, proclaiming the Grand Canyon a national monument. They deferred to Theodore Roosevelt's discretion because the Grand Canyon is an object of unusual scientific interest. I mean, that's it's pretty, it's hard. You can't. I mean, I definitely wouldn't not call it a object of scientific interest. That's for sure. And they didn't even address the size of it in that case, because I guess the decision was that the size of the monument was not disqualifying if the if the protected object was of otherwise scientific interest. So I guess essentially what they found was that if it met this criteria, then the size of the monument really wasn't limiting, or wasn't disqualifying from that designation. I still haven't fully comprehended actually what that means. That's why I like the Tulare County one. It's a little like, I don't know, makes sense. And there's like 3 of this question back to back to back. What power was given to the president by the Antiquities Act of 1906? On what constitutional basis can Congress provide this power to the president? Why has the designation of national monuments caused conflict or controversy in the past? Please explain, focusing on one particular area or conflict of controversy, and be as specific as possible. So, here we go. Congress gave the president the authority to reserve areas of federal land for certain uses or limit certain multiple uses, to preserve certain values of the land, historic, prehistoric objects, and or prehistoric, or objects of historic and scientific interest. President can place limit on these proclaimed monuments or designated lands, and such as, like I mentioned in the last one, mining withdrawals is the most common, or one of the most common. And this power is provided to the president pursuant to the property clause of the Constitution, which allowed Congress to make all needful rules and regulations respecting the property of the United States. I guess like kind of building off that, or going back to the last question, that, like I said, there's kind of a legacy of controversy around that smallest area necessary. The size of these national monuments, and are the presidents designating these monuments to the smallest area compatible, or confined to the smallest area compatible? And going to the Tulare County versus Bush case again, Clinton designated this giant sequoia national monument. I can't remember what the size of it was. Maybe I'll look into that again. It was pretty. I mean, it was big. It was a big monument, and maybe I should also like throw in there, Clinton's like counter argument as to why it was so big. But, anyways, yeah. So, it's, there's they challenged that smallest area compatible, that Tulare County, and the courts essentially came back and said no, there's it yeah, the court, the president does, is not obliged by the Antiquities Act to, make any sort of investigation into what, the smallest area compatible, is. It's up to the discretion. They don't need to, bring in a team of scientists. They don't need to use best available science to determine what that smallest area compatible is. All they, that's totally up to their discretion. And I mean, yes, you could definitely say, like I've mentioned in the past few, is well, probably the biggest limit on their discretion in that case, or in the size case, is like they're wanting to be reelected and remaining, in favorable light of those communities around a national monument, to balance it. What power was given to the president by the Antiquities Act of 1906? So, Congress gave the president the authority to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects owned or controlled by the government to be national monuments, and may reserve as a part of thereof parcels of land confined to the smallest area compatible. That was just kind of a little paraphrase of it, but then I got my same spiel here again. Gives the president authority to reserve sections of federal land for certain uses or limit certain multiple uses, and to preserve certain values of the land, whether it's historic, prehistoric, objects of historic and scientific interest. The president can withdraw these lands from certain multiple uses, such as mining or mineral leasing, mineral entry, grazing. He could limit recreation. All up to his discretion there. What is the most significant program in the U.S. supporting the acquisition of private lands into federal public land ownership for the purposes of access and conservation? Where does the funding for this program come from? So this is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This is a large amount of the funding per year is comes from revenues from royalties from offshore oil and gas development. And then in the textbook, it does mention that the Great American Outdoors Act, which passed, I think it was 2020 or 21. I think it was 2020. But anyways, yeah, the Great American Outdoors Act allocated that $900 million per year. And then, like I said, I think a large portion of that does come from those revenues from royalties of oil and gas drilling offshore. But prior to the passage of that, it was a yearly appropriation from Congress to go into that Land and Water Conservation Fund. And I think it has historically been kind of an underfunded program. I don't know if I'm going to get very far in this run. I don't know what I'm doing. Slacking. In a nutshell, how is the ESA different than NEPA in terms of its substantive, not procedural obligations? Be sure to discuss jeopardy and no-take provision of the ESA. Why has the judiciary been significant in the development of both laws? Please explain with an example and be sure to reference TVA v. Hill. So, kind of looking at NEPA, we got that, one of the biggest focuses was that NEPA Section 102 action forcing mechanism, which essentially, provided that all federal major federal actions, significantly affecting the quality of the human environment required, the completion of an EIS, and then it provided, what needs to be included in the EIS, what needs to be considered in an EIS, foreseeable environmental effects. Adverse environmental effects that could not be avoided, reasonable range of alternatives and the potential effects of those alternatives, short-term uses and maintenance of the long-term productivity of the land, and those irreversible and irretrievable commitments of federal resources. And then additionally, it provides that EIS or the EIS shall accompany the proposal through the existing agency review process. So, that's, that last part there, that EIS shall accompany the proposal through the existing agency review process. That's, because the The EIS, like conducting the EIS is largely procedural. Um, as we talked about, this NEPA is kind of referred to as a procedural statute because, if you go through, you're going to conduct a major federal action. You go through, you conduct the EIS, you identify what you need to, you consider, you go through the process of the EIS. You're free to make, you're not limited in your decision. However, there's that last part, that's requires that the EIS accompany the proposal through the existing agency review process. And like I said, mentioning the procedural, that famous line from the Robertson versus Meadow Valley, it merely prohibits uninformed rather than unwise agency action. So if you go through the process, it's mostly just wanting, the goal of it, that process is just to inform that agency action. However, we have seen that more substantive side of it come out in the Calvert Cliffs versus the Atomic Energy Commission case, where the Atomic Energy Commission, they did they did the procedural part. They conducted the EIS, and they conducted the EIS and everything that was required of it. However, they didn't consider the findings of the EIS to the fullest extent possible in their decision making. So they didn't take that hard look as the court said in that case. They didn't really take a hard look. They didn't consider it. I can't remember exactly how it was, but in that case, I think the Energy Commission had just kind of put that case in an envelope and just kind of passed it through. Whereas after completing the EIS, they really did. Yeah, like I said, they didn't consider it. They didn't look at it. They didn't look at the findings when they were making their decision. They still kind of just went ahead full steam with they had made their decision prior to even conducting the EIS, and they didn't look at the effects that it might have. So that's kind of, I think, like the most substantive part of that NEPA is that requirement to really consider what the findings of that EIS are before going ahead with your action. So then moving over to the ESA, you got that section 7 and 9 both have that, both have substantive and enforceable language. Section 7, the jeopardy and consultation clause or provisions is only directed towards federal actions, and it requires that those agencies, action agencies ensure that the actions will not jeopardize the existence or adversely modify habitat of those of those listed species, and is in that the insurance of that I don't know why I have that in there. Oh, yeah, that's not, that shouldn't be in there. Never mind. But yeah, so section 7 is that that insurance that they're not gonna jeopardize that species or adversely modify its habitat. And then there's also that consultation provision as well in there that requires that action agency, if there's if they find that there is an endangered species in that action area, to formally consult with, or to consult with the appropriate administering agency, whether it be the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, in their decision making process. And talking going to the TVA versus Hill, which directly ties with this jeopardy section 7 jeopardy provision. The courts had enjoined that TVA dam, that where work had already begun and some $80 million had been spent, and because of the findings that the dam would adversely modify critical habitat of the snail darter and would jeopardize the continued existence of the fish, and so they halted construction of that dam in light of those findings. And the ruling of that case showed that the teeth of section 7 and the no matter the economic cost or / significance of the listed species, agency action cannot jeopardize a listed species or adversely modify habitat. So then moving over to section 9, that's more that doesn't pertain the prohibitions against taking section, but it doesn't just pertain to federal actions either. This is open to any person prohibited from taking any such species. And so it makes it unlawful for anyone to take any listed species within the U.S. territory or sea. or U.S. or a territorial sea. And it goes on to define take as harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, trap, kill, capture, or collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. And in this, in the Palila versus the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources case, the courts ruled that harm in the definition of take could also extends to that indirect take that was being conducted by those goats, that was being done by those goats introduced to Hawaii for recreational purposes by the Department of Natural Resources. And so therefore the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources in that case were guilty of an indirect take or breaking that takings provision. I don't know if I answered that at all. God, it's another long one. Jiminy Christmas, dude. These are long questions. Or my answers are long, I guess. Thing is, most of these answers are long, but they don't... I don't know, I feel like half this stuff I don't even need to have in here. Which question is this? I don't even remember this question. What the heck? Holy moly. I feel like just wasting some time here. I feel gassed. I don't know why I'm dragging so bad on this one right now. Okay, I guess not. Yeah. Like I said, I don't even remember this question, but okay, here we go. How does the concept of multiple use differ from the ESA's no jeopardy provision? Be sure to discuss administrative discretion and the role of the courts and how they generally view these laws in your response. So, starting with multiple use places little limits on agency discretion as opposed to the no jeopardy provision of the ESA, which greatly limits agency discretion in decision making. So, multiple use sustained yield act, multiple use mandate. There's no enforceable or substantive language requiring an agency to weigh any of the multiple uses over others when making those management decisions for how that land, for the multiple use management of that land. And going back to that Perkins versus Berglund case, as we talked about earlier, court states the language in the statute can hardly be considered concrete limits upon agency discretion, and that language breathes discretion at every pore. So it's very open, very little limits, very broad limits on agency discretion, if you could even consider that. It doesn't weigh any of the multiple uses at all over others in that discretion. Except for the the comb wash allotment case, which we did talk about a little bit earlier, how that was one of the few times where the courts didn't defer to agency discretion in multiple use management for the land, just because they didn't see that the agency had been made that decision in a reasoned and informed way by balancing those multiple uses in that decision to allow grazing on that comb wash allotment. So from the courts, looking at the the results from courts and trials, is that agencies do have a lot of discretion when it comes to that multiple use management. Like I said, the statute doesn't place any weight on any particular multiple use, but the courts have shown that the agency does need to make these decisions, these multiple use management decisions, in a reasoned and informed manner by making and balancing of those competing resources for that that land. Then kind of moving over to the ESA Section 7, that no jeopardy provision. Each agency shall ensure that any action is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of any endangered species or threatened species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat. So, so, right in that language, you already have that shall. That kind of catches your attention. It's like, okay, this is really, calling that agency to do something here specific, but shall ensure that any action is not likely to jeopardize jeopardize the continued existence or modify or in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat. So it's already it's limiting agency action to anything that will not result in jeopardy of that continued existence or destruction of habitat. So it's it's calling for an insurance that agency action is not going to do that. So it's definitely, like, in that language you can see that there's already some pretty big limits on that agency discretion. Some substantive language with teeth in there. And then you're kind of looking at the TVA Hill case again. That river, the dam had been started, construction on that river, and then that river, after following the snail darters listing, that river was then designated as critical habitat, and the completion of that dam would have destroyed that critical habitat and then jeopardized the continued existence of the snail darter, and so the court placed an injunction on the dam, and halted the dam in order to preserve and not jeopardize that continued existence of the snail darter. And that kind of, this case displays the teeth of that Section 7 substantive language and the no jeopardy provision. So this definitely places limits, that Section 7 places limits on agency actions that may jeopardize a species or adversely modify its habitat. What is one benefit for a listed species covered by a habitat conservation plan? Oh, already on the slide. Hot dog. So for a listed species, these habitat conservation plans, they're made, they're drafted by the landowner. These conservation plans, and they're essentially measures that are conducted in order to minimize and mitigate adverse effects, or to not jeopardize listed species on their property. But yeah, it allow it's the landowner taking measures to minimize and mitigate those adverse effects on those listed species. So essentially, it's definitely gonna result in a much more hospitable and actual conservation effort for that listed species. So theoretically, it's going to provide more habitat, better habitat, higher quality habitat for those listed species that may be on that property. And additionally, it's going to if a landowner conducts and completes an HCP, and it's approved by the the FWS, and so they're allowed to continue their actions. And maybe they're given an incidental take permit. It's gonna reduce those perverse incentives prior to those HCPs, where say if a landowner prior to the HCP, if a landowner found a listed species on his property, he might be just because he's like, I found this listed species on my property, I better get rid of this thing before someone else learns that they're here and I can't do anything on my property anymore without being by being hindered by it. So I think the landowners, with the HCPs, they see these listed species at a lot less of a hindrance. If they can conduct an HCP and continue actions, then they're going to be more accepting of having those those endangered species around or listed species around. I don't think I explained that well at all. What is one benefit to non-federal actors / permittees involved in a habitat conservation plan? So those benefits for those landowners, they enter into that HCP. They take those mitigation and minimization measures, and they receive an incidental take permit. If it's approved by the FWS, they might receive that incidental take permit, and so they're able to continue actions on their property that they may not have been, prior to that HCP and incidental take permit. It removes, it protects that permittee from, maybe remove some of the liability from that permittee. Say they accidentally, incidentally take a listed species. They have that incidental take permit. It protects them from some of those penalties that would usually come from a take. Whether it is incidental or indirect or direct. But since they have shown that they're taking these minimized measures, and they show that take was it was an incidental take, and we have a permit for it, that protects them from that, and that punishment. And then additionally, in 1994, to boost enrollment in the HCP program, the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA produces this no surprises policy, which essentially means that if someone who's entered into an HCP will not be required to commit additional land or resources, beyond the level of mitigation that's already established in their current HCP. So, if, say, circumstances change, but they're enrolled in an HCP that's been approved, they won't be required to change unless there's that. I think there's like that extraordinary circumstances provision there, but that no surprises policy protects them from having to plug more money in or change course. And additionally, like in that, if a landowner addresses an unlisted species in their HCP, taking measures to promote those, and then that unlisted species actually becomes listed, following the no surprises policy, they won't have to draft a new HCP if that that newly listed species is addressed already as an unlisted species in the HCP. But essentially, yeah, that benefits for landowners is it allows them to continue doing work on their property, actions on their property, as well as it protects them from having to do more down the road, as well. Maybe financially or changing their activities on their land. As it applies to the ESA, what is a candidate species? So this is that that warranted but precluded. Any species being considered by the Secretary for listing as an endangered or threatened species, but not yet the subject of a proposed rule. So it's it's kind of it's waiting to it hasn't been it's not protected. Even prior if it's maybe not listed at the time, federal agencies or other entities may propose strategies to improve the status prior to listing. So there might be mitigation strategies implemented before if it is a candidate species to maybe prevent it from becoming listed as threatened or endangered. Like I said, that warranted but precluded. Listing may be warranted, but at the time, it might be precluded due to other agency priorities. I got a slide for this one. Maybe not. Okay. Oh, here we go. With sufficient detail, describe an example of how the ESA has moved from being a strictly prohibitive law to one that is more permissive in nature. Be sure to discuss or reference TVA v. Hill somewhere in your response. So I guess initially with the passing of the 1973 Endangered Species Act, signed into law by Tricky Dick Nixon, as a species was, I guess I haven't mentioned this earlier, but so as a species was listed, critical habitat, the critical habitat, section 5 of the ESA. But anyways, critical habitat was required to be designated as well within 1 year of listing. And in the original 1973 ESA, same as the same as like the listing decision for uh, fur species, critical habitat designation was to be based solely on on scientific best available scientific and commercial data. So, 1970, the TVA Hill case, 1978, the snail darter is listed as endangered. After, the TVA dam's already a couple of years into production, late 60s, approved. They start construction. By the time, snail darter is then listed as endangered, I think it was 1975. And following the listing of the snail darter as endangered, using that best available commercial and scientific data, they determined that the Little Tennessee River is especially above the dam, is designated as critical habitat for the snail darter, and it is determined that the construction of the dam would adversely modify that critical snail darter habitat and jeopardize this population. So, so this is then, in the case, it's found that this is a violation of Section 7, and the dam is, the $80 million that had already been spent on the dam is washed down the river, and the dam is enjoined and halted by the courts, due to this violation of Section that jeopardy provision. So then, following TVA v. Hill, and kind of in response to this, the uproar and some controversy of the decision, you get the 1978 amendments published from Congress. Like I said, direct response to TVA v. Hill, and first of which is that it changes that the critical habitat designation is no longer to be based solely on best available science, but also requires cost-benefit analysis or economic analysis, as well as any other relevant impact of specifying any particular area as critical habitat. So it's no longer just that best available science when you're designating critical habitat, but it also is looking at potential cost effects and other relevant impacts on that land. And then additionally, in these amendments, there's that creation of the God Squad, or God Squad Committee, or former Endangered Species Committee. It's made up of a bunch of secretaries from different agencies, and essentially, this God Squad may exempt an action from Section 7 authority if there are no reasonable and prudent alternatives, the benefits of the action clearly outweigh the environmental cost, and the action is of regional or national significance. So following that TVA v. Hill decision is that no longer is critical habitat going to be designated best solely on best available science, and then also I don't know why I have northern spotted owl on this slide. This is the one I was going to change and then couldn't figure out which one it was. Anyway, distracted. But then you also have that God Squad too, who can come in and vote to exempt an action if they find these things too with a particular case. And like I said, this is kind of a response to that the enjoyment of that that $80 million dam, that money lost on that project in the TVA v. Hill decision. And the God Squad, it's comprised of, just to show like how this is considering more of those economic effects, or those effects outside the best available science. But it's secretaries of Ag, Army, Interior, administrators of the EPA, NOAA, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and then state representatives appointed by the president. So it's definitely a real mix on this team. And even after the formation of the God Squad, they went back and reviewed TVA v. Hill and upheld that decision by the Supreme Court. They still found it to be even in light of these, they couldn't find any of these, these to exempt that action from Section 7. All right, so I'm gonna stop here. I because I got plenty of time yet, so I might come back and film the first few questions. But all right,